like to introduce Cameron Muir, the Chief Economist of the British Columbia Real Estate Association. As BCREA's Chief Economist, Cameron analyses and forecasts the BC housing market, the provincial economy, and the macroeconomic drivers. As BCREA's economic spokesman, he communicates regularly with media and industry stakeholders. Cameron joined BCREA as Chief Economist in 2006. Before joining BCREA, he spent 10 years with CMHC as a senior market analysis for BC region. Cameron has degrees in diplomas from SFU, UBC, Kwantlen University College, and the College of Hard Knocks. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Cameron Muir.
I didn't realize the intro was going to be longer than the presentation. Obviously, I'm an economist, and I work out of the BC Real Estate Association, so we represent the 11 real estate boards in the province. So I tend to look at things from a macro perspective, 30,000 feet, and so I look at these buyer surveys, and I go, well, first of all, how has things changed from before a year or two ago? And second thing is, how is it different here than it is in other parts of the province? So those are the first kind of things that I look at that kind of pique my interest. So there are a number of things that are going on through the Vancouver Island Real Estate Board region that we don't see in a lot of other parts of the province. First of all, I guess if we look at, am I going backwards or why is this? Okay, that's weird. Okay, when we look at, I guess we set us up here in the Vancouver Island Real Estate Board area, that typically accounts for about 10% of home sales in the province. It's a very large geographic area, but of course the population isn't large enough, or the housing stock isn't large enough to make a huge impact in the overall provincial numbers. Of course, one of the things that we see going on right now in the province is that Vancouver, there's some real skewing going on in pricing in Vancouver about a lot more single attached homes are selling in these pricier markets. So it's skewing the Vancouver numbers, skewing the provincial numbers, and the national numbers simply because of its size. Whereas in smaller board areas, we don't get that. Overall sales activity this year probably going to be about the same as it was last year, albeit down about 1%. At least that's what we're forecasting. Next year, we're looking at about being up about 1 or 2% in terms of overall sales activity. But overall, for this board area, and I think it mirrors across the province going forward, is we're unlikely to see these kinds of record sales numbers that we saw in the previous run-up before the financial crisis and recession. We're likely to see sales averaging around the 10-year average, and in fact, over the next couple of years, probably a little bit below the 10-year average in sales. And that's largely to do with the fact that home prices are still quite high from a historical perspective. We have an economy that's growing, but it's growing kind of in fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Our largest trading part in the United States is still a long way to go from full economic recovery, so our trade side of our economy is going to be a while before it's firing on all cylinders. And so as a result, we're not going to see that kind of consumer demand, as well as going forward the next 18 months, we expect some normalization of interest rates, which is going to further erode affordability and impact purchasing power. So while the economy is growing, we're going to see some job growth from rising wages, all those good things, fundamentals of the housing market. That's going to be somewhat offset by higher mortgage interest rates that are going to start to pull back or erode that affordability and purchasing power of consumers. But in terms of who was buying last year in Vancouver Island, well, not much change from what we've seen in previous years. This is 2009. 2009, we see that, well, about half the buyers came from outside the board area, which is quite unusual for the market, for any market in British Columbia, except for perhaps the East Kootenays. So you have a very large number of people that are coming from outside the board area. You've got about, and this was in 2009, you had about 10 to 12% coming from areas such as other parts of BC, from Alberta is a big source, particularly because of the air connections in the northern part of the island. You have 7% were coming from Vancouver, 6% from Victoria coming up here and moving. It's very much as a result of, partly because of economic reasons and job growth, but more so as a result of Vancouver Island being a preferred destination for retirees. And we have a very large number of retirees settle on the island. Now, this is the issue. So if we look, I'll just show you the changes. It doesn't change much, and within the margin of error in any kind of survey, it's not much difference. So last year, about 36% came from the same area, or 2009, 2010, 38%. We're still about 45% of all home buyers in the Vancouver Island Real Estate Board area are coming from outside the board area. Outside of the board area. So we've got about 8% for Vancouver, 10% each for other BC and Alberta. Gulf Island, a very small number. We just group that in there. So very much these people are moving here. Most of them is largely a result of them making retirement decisions and moving here to when they decide to play golf full time. Now, it's often said, or some people have said that retirees are not very good for an economy. We need some growth propelling industries, and that's very important too. We need that in an economy, but retirees are actually a very important attribute to local markets and to local economies, because retirees, particularly when they're coming here from other areas, they bring with them a large amount of net wealth that they amass somewhere else, and they're bringing it over here. And what that does is it supports things like the home building industry, which is a high value-added industry. There's a lot of economic spin-offs and multipliers from home building. It supports high-value services such as banking and doctors and optometrists and podiatrists and landscape architects and all those kinds of things, all the services that go into retirees, which tend to be very high-paying and very stable jobs. And the other thing that's important about retirees, too, is retirees, particularly those that are fortunate enough to have those defined pension benefit plans, is it doesn't matter where the economic cycle is, they're still spending their money every month as it goes. So it kind of moderates those swings or boom and bust cycles in economies that, much the same way as perhaps the Georgia Street moderates our weather patterns here, keeping the cold weather from getting too cold, or the same on the opposite side. Major reason for purchase, I think what's interesting is a lot of people think that there's a lot of recreation or investor buyers going on in this part of the world, but in fact, in terms of total sales, that's not true at all. It's the vast majority, and this is 2009, 95% of all buying going on was for principal residence. Last year, which was 2010, we got 96%, so that's pretty stable in terms of what we see the buying patterns. That investment rental side is only about 2%, 1 or 2% of the marketplace. So when we see changes in overall investor psychology, it certainly doesn't have a big impact on this market here. Would in a market such as Vancouver, where we see a high number of investors who are going in and buying condos, either 1 or 3 at a time. And once the tides of investment change, then obviously there's some risks about them dumping it on the market, about the market risks of oversupply and all that kind of thing. It simply is not doesn't really exist here in Vancouver Island, which is, I think it's pretty, in terms of the island, in terms of the housing market, the stock, and who's buying here, it's a fairly stable region given other parts of the province. First-time buyers, well, we look at first-time buyers consistently through Vancouver Island Board here, make up about 15 to 19%. Well, if this was in a major urban center, people would be going, pulling their hair out, because it would be a terrible thing. Vancouver, for example, you've got 30% or 35% are first-time buyers. So a part of that is the age demographic here. We've got a lot of retirees, as well as, right now we're seeing the boomers, the pig and the python, if you will, as they're getting older, moving along. You're seeing the first wave of them now. And that's going to really drive a lot of sales activity in this part of the world over the next 5 to 10 years. First-time buyers, we see in Port Alberni, 31%. That's more representative of what perhaps Victoria or Vancouver would be like, whereas we have the lowest number of first-time buyers typically in areas like Parksville and Qualicum, which obviously we know is much more of a retirement community. If we look at the aging population, those demographics going forward, by the time we get to about 2035 or so, the entire population of British Columbia is going to look exactly like the Parksville-Qualicum population is today, meaning we're going to have about 36% of the population is going to be aged over 55 years old. And so the entire province is progressing towards that, I don't want to call it paradigm, but that landscape, I think is a better word. Share of retiree purchases. So there's some markets that retirees are into more than others, and there's some significant changes. What I thought was interesting in 2010 is that there was quite a large change in the Parksville-Qualicum area. that in 2009, I think right after the recession, that many retirees were still a little skittish. Perhaps they were also had some issues around selling their principal residence where they came from, of course, knowing that about half of them are moving from outside the island. Whereas in 2010, we saw a much better market conditions, so they were able to sell those homes and move to their desired destination. So parts of Qualicum, very strong areas last year, as well as the islands. Port Alberta, West Coast, it was quite surprising that we saw actually a dip in the number of the proportion of retiree sales going on, and I think that's likely the result of, we saw probably a larger increase in first-time buyers last year, getting into the market in Port Alberta, thinking this was the time to buy, and so proportionally in the sales, they kind of crowded out the senior purchases. So really popular home characteristics, well, single attached homes represent about 60% of all the sales. You got to kind of take that with a grain of salt in the sense that when you look at the home types that are selling, typically it's just representative of the housing stock. So if you went and looked at the housing stock, I bet 60% of the housing stock are single attached homes, and that's what's happening. 2 to 3 bedroom units, again, that's most likely what the size or bedroom, the number of bedrooms they had. Double garage with vinyl exterior. Vinyl exterior is probably representative of that building boom that began in the 80s when vinyl was a very desirable exterior of a home. And ocean or mountain view is pretty hard not to get that on the island. So, which is kind of nice. I know in parts of the mainland, if you stand in your bathroom on the toilet and look out the window and see a little corner of water, that's called a ocean view, and you get another bunch of money for that. That's all I had to say about in terms of the survey. One other thing that comes to mind is when I was going through is about how people got introduced to the property, and every year I see that start to ramp up. I think in 2009 about 21% were introduced to the property through the internet. And I believe it was in 2010 last year, that's raised up now to 24 or 25%. Almost a quarter of home sales are occurring, or at least the home that they're choosing, they're being introduced to that home via the internet. So it shows that the growing power and relevance of not just the internet, but also such things as social media activities, those things where people get introduced to the property from other things besides the traditional drive-by and see the sign on the lawn and go, oh, I like that place. And I think that's a sign of things to come in the future. I think I'll sign off there and